The dusty horizon split open as my truck creaked down the long, winding road leading to Redwood Ranch. The same soil I'd played on as a boy, now cracked from drought and silence. I hadn't been back in nearly a decade, not since my parents passed, and I was swallowed whole by the grind of city courts and gavel-wielding politics. But now, with retirement behind me and the bench in my rear view, I was coming home. Or so I thought. The land stretched wide around many acres of open ranch my family had held for 3 generations. A cabin nestled between the sycamores still stood tall, weathered but proud. I slowed as I approached the gate, expecting rusted hinges and quiet stillness. Instead, I found steel. A massive iron sign bolted to my own gate greeted me with a sterile punch to the gut. Serenity Pines, HOA private community. Residents only. Unauthorized entry prohibited. My name was nowhere. Not on the gate. Not on the mailbox. Not even on the property marker, which now bore a serial number and some HOA-approved color code. I stepped out, boots landing with a thud on the gravel. A thick silence pressed against me, a natural tense. Something was wrong. I wasn't gone that long. As I inspected the new locks clamped onto my own property, a white SUV came barreling up the dirt road, dust clouds chasing it like a swarm. The vehicle screeched to a halt in front of me, and out stepped a woman with the precision of someone who'd been practicing confrontations in the mirror. Blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, pastel tracksuit, clipboard in hand like it was a badge of honor. "Excuse me," she barked, stepping between me and the gate like I was a trespasser. "This is a private community, HOA property. You can't be here." I turned slowly. "This is my ranch," I said evenly. "Been in my family since 1962. She snorted. "Not anymore. You must be mistaken. This area was incorporated into Serenity Pines last year. If you don't leave, I'll have to call the sheriff." I crossed my arms. "Go ahead," she hesitated, uncertain whether I was bluffing. But the phone was already in her hand, thumb hovering over the screen like a trigger. "I'm Karen Ellington," she snapped, "president of the HOA. This land was clearly abandoned. We followed all procedures. You're on private HOA maintained grounds now." "Ah, Karen," of course her name was Karen. "I'm Judge Marcus Lang," I said, eyes fixed on her. "The judge who issued the ruling 3 weeks ago, dissolving your entire HOA. Her face twitched. It wasn't confusion, it was disbelief. She'd built herself into a queen, and someone just knocked over her castle. "I don't believe you." "You don't have to," I said. "But you might want to check your inbox, or the official county register." Serenity Pines was illegally annexing properties, including mine. I reviewed the evidence, declared it overreach, and disbanded the entire organization. She laughed, a shrill sound too sharp for the open air. "You're bluffing. No one would dare shut us down. We built this community." "No," I replied. "You built a bureaucracy on land that was never yours to govern. You fined people for leaving their sprinklers on. You painted over murals kids made on their own garages. You threatened veterans for flying flags that weren't HOA approved." Her phone was still in her hand, trembling slightly now. "You can call the cops if you want," I said, walking past her. "But this is my land, and I'm staying." Karen didn't follow. She stood there, mouth tight, fingers clenched around her clipboard like it could somehow restore the authority that had just crumbled. Inside the cabin, everything was just as I'd left it, dusty, quiet, peaceful. But outside, a storm was brewing. I could feel it in the air. She wasn't going to let this go. People like her never did. I pulled back the old curtains and looked out across the land. This was mine again. But reclaiming it wouldn't come easy, and Karen was just getting started. The next morning, a loud banging echoed through the stillness. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, just in time to see a golf cart screech to a halt at the base of my driveway. Karen was back. Only this time, she wasn't alone. 2 men, in identical polos, both carrying clipboards, trailed behind her like loyal footmen. All 3 marched up to the gate with purpose, eyes fixed on me like I'd vandalized their suburban utopia. "You've got 24 hours to vacate," Karen announced, holding out a stapled packet like it was a court order. "These are your violations. You're in breach of multiple HOA standards. I took the packet without touching her hand. There is no HOA. That ruling is final. One of her cronies stepped forward. You're using unapproved fencing materials. That barn's paint color isn't within code. And you've got livestock roaming too close to the main road. I laughed. The main road is mine. Karen's jaw clenched. We're appealing the ruling. The HOA isn't dead, it's just regrouping. And until then, we're enforcing what's already been passed. I scanned the so-called violations. They were laughably absurd rules written in the same dictatorial tone I'd seen from HOAs all across the state. No outdoor clotheslines, no seasonal decorations before November. No tools left visible in daylight hours. All of it was meaningless. Now, but Karen was trying to hold power with smoke and mirrors. I'm not leaving, I said, folding the papers and dropping them into a flower pot. You're wasting your breath. Karen's eyes narrowed to slits. Don't test me. This community stands on order. You're a threat to everything we've built. I'm not your threat, I replied. Reality is, she turned on her heel and marched back to her cart, her two minions hurrying behind her. The cart zipped away, kicking up a plume of dust that lingered long after they were gone. By evening, things had escalated. For notice of non-compliance, flyers were nailed to the trees at my property line. Someone had taken the liberty of painting yellow lines across my driveway, and a crude sign labeled "Under Investigation" stood where my mailbox used to be. Karen wasn't just grasping at power, she was declaring war. But she underestimated two things: my patience and my preparation. I hadn't returned without doing my homework. Before stepping foot on this land again, I'd pored over every document, every boundary line, every dated signature. I knew exactly where her influence ended, and more importantly, I knew how desperately she needed people to believe she still had any. That night, I walked the length of my property with a lantern, peeling off every notice and tossing them into the fire pit. The flames crackled as paper turned to ash, each one a monument to Karen's unraveling empire. At dawn, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up the gravel road. I met the deputy at the gate. Morning, Judge Lang, he said, tipping his hat. A report of an unauthorized trespasser and livestock violations. I gestured behind me. Cows haven't left the fence. You want to see the court documents? He nodded. I handed him a copy of the final dissolution ruling. His eyes scanned it line by line, then he whistled low. Well, this clears it up. She's not giving up, I said. I know, he replied, shaking his head. Karen's called us 5 times this week. Claims she's protecting the community from a retired judge rebuilding his family ranch. The deputy gave a tired grin. We'll document the visit and close the case. But she won't stop. She never does. He tipped his hat again and drove off. I watched the taillights disappear. Behind a hill, the echo of tires crunching over gravel fading into the distance. Karen had lost the law. Now she was coming for control, and I was ready. 2 weeks later, I received a summons not from law enforcement, but from Karen herself. She'd filed a civil suit against me in county court, claiming the HOA was unlawfully dissolved, that I'd abused my position as a judge for personal gain, and that I posed an imminent threat to community harmony. The language was theatrical, bloated with legal jargon she clearly didn't understand, and riddled with inaccuracies. But the filing was official. She wanted war on paper. Fine. She was about to get a front row seat to her own unraveling. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse in a crisp navy blazer and worn leather boots. I didn't need the robe anymore. I was the ruling Karen. Stood on the plaintiff's side of the courtroom, flanked by a fresh attorney, young, wide-eyed, and clearly in over his head. She wore a stark white pantsuit like she was testifying before Congress. Her face was pulled so tight with pride it could snap. The judge presiding over the case was Marlene V. Gosmert, no nonsense, and a former colleague I'd mentored for years. I'd stepped back to avoid any conflict of interest, but she'd been assigned randomly, and by the look in her eyes, she wasn't in the mood for games. Double quotes, Ms. Ellington, she began. You're alleging that Mr. Lang used his judicial position to dismantle a legally operating HOA for personal benefit. Do you have supporting documentation? Karen stood, voice dripping with false conviction. Your Honor, Judge Lang had a vendetta. He abandoned his property for years, and when we formed a thriving HOA, he returned just to tear it down. That's abuse of power. Marlene raised an eyebrow. Are you aware that Judge Lang recused himself from the ruling once the appeal was filed and that the final decision was reviewed and upheld by the State Appeals Board? Karen blinked. No. I wasn't informed of that. Her lawyer stiffened beside her. Marlene continued. Furthermore, your annexation of private land, including Lang Ranch, was conducted without the legal consent of the landowner. According to the county register, your HOA extended its reach beyond the designated jurisdiction. That's not overreach, it's trespass. Karen's composure cracked for the first time. She turned on her lawyer. You told me we could fight this. Her attorney cleared his throat. Ma'am, I didn't have access to these documents. They, change things. Marlene fixed her with a calm, icy stare. This court doesn't exist to validate your authority, Miss Ellington. It exists to uphold the law. And the law has already spoken. Karen slumped into her chair, stunned. The courtroom was silent save for the scratch of the judge's pen signing the dismissal. Case dismissed with prejudice, she said, and Miss Ellington, any further legal harassment may be met with sanctions. The gavel came down. Outside the courthouse, local press had caught wind of the dispute. HOA overreach stories had become catnip for public attention, especially when one involved a former judge dismantling the very system so many feared. Reporters swarmed, microphones up, cameras flashing. Judge Lang, did you abuse your position? For revenge? I smiled. No, I used it to restore something far more valuable. No one should be forced to ask permission to live on their own land. Karen stormed past the cameras without a word. Gone was the woman who strutted up to my ranch with a clipboard and an iron grip on her fiefdom. In her place was a bitter figure, unraveling under the weight of her own arrogance. By the time I made it back to the ranch, the air felt different, lighter, calmer. I parked the truck, stepped onto the porch, and looked out across the hills. The fences were sturdy, the barn was freshly stained, and a young hawk circled high above the open sky. The courtroom battle was over, but I knew this story wasn't quite done. Some people accept defeat, others let it fester, and Karen, she was never one to go down without a final strike. For a brief moment, it seemed like peace had returned to Redwood Ranch. The fences stood unbothered, the livestock grazed undisturbed, and I spent my mornings sipping coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise carve golden lines across the valley. The war, I thought, was finally over. But Karen wasn't the type to retreat quietly. It began with silence to much of it. The neighborhood newsletter, once a weekly manifesto of HOA policies and petty fines, vanished. Then, a handful of her supporters began posting cryptic messages in the community forum. Taking back our streets. Reclaiming order. The judge won the court but not the people. That's when the drone appeared. At first I thought it was a hobbyist, but it hovered always around 6 a.m., always just above the barn or near my kitchen window. I watched it through binoculars one morning and noticed the tiny camera beneath its belly. Its lens trained directly on me. I dealt with surveillance before federal cases, mob trials, real predators. This wasn't subtle. This was psychological. Warfare. So I contacted a tech-savvy friend who owed me a favor. Within 48 hours, we had a low-frequency jammer installed near the barn. The next time the drone buzzed in, it dipped erratically, spun like a wounded bird, and crashed into the field with a final, defeated WHIR. Inside the drone was a SIM-enabled microSD card. Guess whose name the data plan was registered under? Karen Ellington. When the sheriff's deputies showed up at her house to issue a formal warning, the look on her face, caught in a single photo snapped by a reporter, said it all. Rage, disbelief, and humiliation wrapped into one bitter snarl. The incident made the local news again, only this time, public opinion had shifted. Her loyal base was thinning, fast, but the final blow didn't come from me, it came from her own neighbors. After weeks of failed attempts to resurrect the HOA, after lawsuits, intimidation, and public embarrassment, the residents of Serenity Pines held a vote, not for a new president, but to dissolve any attempt to revive the HOA altogether. They were tired of the rules. Tired of the drama. Tired of watching one woman hold a neighborhood hostage in the name of community standards. The vote passed 93% in favor. Karen lost everything in one motion. No more newsletters. No more petty violations. No more executive powers. Her title, her clipboard, her illusion of authority gone. I didn't attend the final meeting. I didn't need to. I was on the porch that evening, boots up on the railing, sipping sweet tea while the stars bloomed overhead. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was earned. A week later, a moving truck pulled up to Karen's home. She didn't look at me when she loaded the last of her boxers into the trailer. But I watched from a distance as she paused at the end of her driveway. Taking one last look at the land she once tried to rule, she left without a word. Redwood Ranch was mine again. Not just by deed or court ruling, but by spirit. I walked the land every morning, each step no longer haunted by the tension of a clipboard queen lurking just beyond the tree line. Neighbors began waving again. Some even dropped by with fresh-baked pies and handshakes. One man, a retired mechanic, offered to fix the rusted windmill near the back pasture. Said it was the least he could do. That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't just my victory. It was a community reclaiming its soul. The land remembered what it was before the fences and fines. And so did we. I hung the final page of the court ruling. Above the fireplace, a reminder of the day. The law set the land free. Because power without purpose always crumbles. And justice never forgets its way home.